Honoring the Outermost, Saturn in the PICATRIX, by D.Att. From among the classical 7 planets, Saturn, the first in the Chaldean order, that dim and slow-moving planet riding the outermost sphere, will be the topic of this study today. We will be chiefly unpacking some of the ways this planet is represented in the Latin PICATRIX, a text which had a great impact in the latter half of the 15th century on the general European conception of astrological bodies and their many associations. This Latin translation of al-Qurtubi's Ghayat al-Hakim was read with varying degrees of approval and disapproval by such giants in the history of magic as Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. For better or for worse, it played a significant role in reinforcing and fleshing out these Renaissance men's respective thoughts about the nature of the cosmos, that is, as what has been called by Stephen Farmer, a highly syncretic, quote, exaggeratedly hierarchical and correlative worldview. A chiefly intellectual or mental world centered not on the interaction of physical particles in an endless expanse of space, but on the hidden sympathies between all the things of this world on a great chain of being hanging down from God himself, held together through a complex, imperceptible network of stellar rays. For many throughout the Middle Ages, from al-Qurtubi to Ficino, to plumb the inner workings of these sympathies along the great chain of being was the very height of philosophy itself, since it was by this process alone that they believed man could perfect himself. This discussion, then, will be a descriptive analysis of how some chief correspondences developed with respect to the planet Saturn, how he appears in the Latin PICATRIX, how his portfolio changed from antiquity to the Renaissance, especially through the influential writings of Ficino, and lastly, a closing word on the planet's long-lasting associations with the Jews. I decided to use Saturn as a general case study on the 7 planets in the PICATRIX because he is the planet most relevant to the scholar. This association is clearly expressed in the PICATRIX, but one can find it especially in the writings of Ficino, who further helped to sublimate the almost purely negative aspects of Saturn and melancholy from the traditional medieval European perspective into something more productive and less fatalistic. In the words of Erich Zaffron, who did his own study on the changing role of Saturn in the Renaissance, Saturn had long been, quote, the representative of the lowest rung of medieval society. Individuals born under his influence were held in scant regard until, with the last quarter of the 15th century, a Neoplatonic elevation of the deity somewhat reformed their character. End quote. This Neoplatonic elevation Zaffron mentions is, of course, a stand-in for the philosophical and astromagical work done by Ficino. New developments in theology and natural philosophy were emerging at the time of the late 15th century, which propped up the idea that although individuals were certainly influenced by celestial bodies, with the help of practical magic, they could manipulate the boundaries of their respective destinies. To use an idiom often attributed to both Cicero and Thomas Aquinas that is most demonstrative of Christian attitudes toward astrology during this period, astra inclinant, sed non obligant. The stars incline, but do not bind. This emphasis on free will rather than determinism in thinkers like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola would go so far as to become one of the chief defining features of the Renaissance in the minds of 19th and 20th century scholars like Jacob Burckhardt, who first stressed this era as one defined by historical discontinuity. Ficino saw the things of the world as signified, but not necessarily caused by the conjunctions of the heavenly bodies. And this overall reinterpretation of astrological theory would extend well beyond him, on into a total reassessment for Europe's relationship with astrological determinism. As such, Saturn was not all malefics and misfortune for Ficino. Rather, he was furthest from the earth and therefore closest to the divine mind of God. Here, Saturn was a liminal figure, most closely representing the idea of eternity's descent from a kind of abnormal or non-time into normal time, or vice versa, the last rung in the ascent from normal time into eternity. If Saturn was unfortunate to you, it was because you refused to learn how to align yourself to his malignant effects. Though itself belonging to the older Neoplatonic and Aristotelian causal school of thought, as exemplified by the Arabic natural philosophy of Al-Kindi, Abu Mashar, and the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Latin Picatrix came to play a vital role in Ficino's psycho-spiritual reconceptualization of astral magic in the West. The discovery of a letter he dictated to Michele Acciari to be sent to Filippo Valori, wherein he discusses his cautious use of Picatrix in the composition of his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, confirms this. In fact, in response to Valori's request to borrow his copy of the Picatrix, Ficino explains that there's no use in reading it since everything of value has been, quote, transferred to his De Vita, the self-help book he wrote for his melancholic patron, Lorenzo de' Medici. If you read it diligently, says the letter, you will be left wanting nothing from that Picatrix. In his third book, for example, Ficino draws from Picatrix, book 2, 10, 14, and 41, his instructions on how to craft a sapphire ring for life extension using an image of Saturn in his hour. Though reluctant to use such images, Ficino justified his use of such magical objects with support from the Speculum Astronomiae, a work commonly attributed to Albertus Magnus in response to the 1277 condemnations of Averroan and Aristotelian natural philosophy at the University of Paris. Although Ficino's sun sign was in Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars, more importantly, his ascendant, that is what lay on the eastern horizon at the time of his birth, comprised of Saturn in Aquarius. While Saturn ascending in Aquarius did indeed signify ill health to Ficino, the flip side was that a decrepit body or crippling depression would also force him into desk-bound contemplation, to rise up and out of his body toward the realm of perfect ideas. Angela Voss calls this Ficino's humanistic instead of deterministic view. Here, melancholy too, largely thought of as evil during the Middle Ages, was reevaluated. In a letter to his friend Giovanni Cavalcanti, Ficino called his Saturnine nature a unique and divine gift. As both a priest and a melancholic, Ficino understood himself to be a veritable child of Saturn, But this was not necessarily a negative lot. To him, Saturn was not only the most powerful star, but also the noblest. He would use the metaphor of hidden gold in referring to the gift this astral configuration offered to those specifically on a philosophical path. That is, the path leading to the goal of the sage, the complete knowledge and understanding of creation's inner workings. A life devoted to the study of divine truths was most natural for a person of Saturnine birth, but Ficino tells us in chapter 22 of his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda that just as the sun is hostile to nocturnal animals, Saturn is hostile to those people who are either leading publicly an ordinary life or even to those fleeing the company of the crowd but not laying aside their ordinary emotions. To Ficino, wisdom could be achieved by working along with one's astrological allotment, rather than giving in to despair on account of one's ill-fated natal chart. Now, in order to understand Saturn as he was understood in the 15th century, we need to soften our modern materialism, which sees him as a physical object hurling through space around the sun at a mere 21,637 miles per hour, taking 29.5 years to complete a single orbit around the sun. Instead, we need to see Saturn as a star, a spiritual entity endowed with a will of his own, surrounded by invisible angels or spirits, in Arabic the ruhaniyah, and put in place by God as part of the mechanism which weaves together the fabric of the microcosm or lesser world, that is, elements, minerals, vegetables, animals, and of course human beings. Though himself more interested in the path of contemplation, Plotinus had a tremendous influence on the medieval conception of sympathetic magic, especially through the authors of the talismanic pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, such as the Liber al-Istimachis, which was an important source to al-Qurtubi in assembling the Hayat al-Hakim / PICATRIX. Plotinus, in his Aeneids, wrote, "I think that the wise men of old who made temples and statues in the wish that the gods should be present to them, looking to the nature of the all, had in mind that the nature of the soul is everywhere easy to attract, but that if someone were to construct something sympathetic to it and able to receive a part of it, it would of all things receive soul most easily. That which is sympathetic to it is what imitates it in some way, like a mirror able to catch the reflection of a form." End quote. Although our melancholic priest claimed that his De Vita Libri Tres were ultimately just a commentary on Plotinus, despite the fact that Plotinus had never himself been interested in theurgy or talismans, it's obvious upon reading Ficino's manual for achieving one's perfect nature that he was drawing more definitely from the Neoplatonists like Iamblichus, Proclus, and Synesius, along with the Latin translations of Arabic magicians, especially Abu Mashar and PICATRIX, though he was certainly reluctant to openly admit it. Whenever recommending suspect procedures, particularly talismanic operations, he would hide behind the authorities of the Arabs and the Platonists, only recommending the operations which he deemed salubrious and in line with established Christian principles. To deal with this complication, Ficino wrote an apology in which he broke down magic into two categories: the demonic, which he called inquisitive, and the natural, which he called necessary. The latter he claimed to practice exclusively, purely as a means to achieving optimal health, while the former he claimed to reject wholeheartedly, all in spite of the numerous operations he conveyed in De Vita, unambiguously enacted for manipulating spirits. Here I wish to turn now to a discussion of some of the chief correspondences that were traced out between Saturn and the things of this world, leading up to Ficino's reconceptualizations of traditional astrology. Perhaps the most fundamental of these concern Saturn's relationship to the concept of time. The reason Saturn is associated with time in his imagery is twofold. 1. Because as the outermost planet of the Chaldean order, his orbit encapsulates all other orbits, and he was thus believed to have been the first planet set in motion, initiating time by subsequently setting every other planet in motion in the spheres below. And 2, because in his form as a Latin god, he was thought once upon a time to have ruled over a golden age, an age which is fundamentally different from that of our observers, an idea which creates a sense of temporalization and of historical discontinuity, that is, a sense of vast differences across time. So, on account of his mythological portfolio, his physical distance from the Earth, and the length of time it takes for him to transit across the sky, Saturn most closely reflected the Platonic concept that time is the moving image of eternity. In Plato's Timaeus, there was laid down the idea that a demiurge created an unmoving image of eternity which they called aeon. Once set in motion, however, the moving image of eternity became known as chronos. Over centuries, this figure was syncretized with Saturnus, the Latin god of a pre-Lapsarian agricultural golden age who ruled prior to the reign of Zeus Jupiter. Cicero, incidentally a translator of Plato's Timaeus, elaborated on this in De Natura Deorum 25 by explaining that the Greek name Chronos is synonymous to the Latin word chronos, which means a span of time, since he sustains the cycle of the seasons and the periodization of time, while the name Saturnus denotes how saturated he was from devouring his children, a folk etymology based on the Latin saturare tyrannis, with the implication that time devours all. Cicero tells us how, quote, Saturn was bound by Jove in order that time's courses might not be unlimited, and that Jove might fetter him by the bonds of the stars. End quote. From antiquity, then, Saturn was associated with time and the longue durée, and by extension, through the extremely correlative pre-modern mind, with elderliness, decrepitude, melancholy, disease, foul odors, and misfortune. For this, among other reasons, Saturn was lord of the removed, the contemplative, the sedentary, and thus, by extension, Saturn was lord of scholars. Saturn's relation to both Judaism and prophecy could also be explained to exist on account of his nearness to a state of timelessness. Following the Platonic dichotomy between divine and human knowledge, it was understood that true prophecy was a kind of madness that came from a level of consciousness which transcended the ostensibly cyclical motion of normal time. Human knowledge was largely concerned with the changing and the mutable, while divine truths, such as geometry or sacred scripture, dwelt outside of time, in the mind of God himself, where past, present, and future folded into one eternity. Now, despite Saturn's fundamentally ancient roots, we must not allow too much of the philosophy or theurgy from pagan antiquity to color our views of either 10th or 15th century astral magic. Just in the same way, we mustn't allow too much of our understanding of modern astronomy to anachronistically color our views. By the Middle Ages, the planets had long lost their status as gods and had been demoted into spiritual forces existing within nature, set in place by God for executing His will. In the words of Dieter Bloom, quote, "The bridge leading back to the gods of antiquity was thus definitely burned. Even educated readers would not have made the connection anymore. So, in the field of planetary astrology, there was, in fact, no survival of the pagan gods." End quote. Indeed, the widely recognized image of a winged, scythe-bearing, child-eating Saturn didn't reappear until the 15th century. At least as early as the time Ptolemy composed his Tetrabiblos and Almagest in the 2nd century AD, astrology had been defined as a science of causal influences from the spiritual world down into the world of matter. The planets acted like nodes within a network of analogies, radiating particular influences down to Earth through the ether, connecting all things under their dominion. Ptolemy's Aristotelian cosmos was eventually appropriated by various groups, one of which held to a stoically inspired determinism which left little to no wiggle room in negotiating with the gods. Here, and on into the later Arabic tradition, as exemplified by the aforementioned thinkers like Al-Kindi, Abu Mashar, and the Brethren of Purity, the cosmos was stripped of its gods, and the planets consequently became natural philosophical, or, quote, scientific, spiritual powers endowed with their own souls and wills, rather than autonomous divine beings. These indeed were thought of as creators, but far from being eternal and uncreated. Bloom again writes, quote, "When it was decided to depict these astrological powers, the appropriate images first had to be invented, and it was not Ovid, but Abu Mashar who was consulted." End quote. By the Middle Ages, the formerly independent gods who were now spiritual, that is, supralunary objects, believed to have been set in motion by the prime mover, and whose effects could be only understood through the astronomical calculation of the rays they emitted. This, then, is how the reader of the PICATRIX was meant to conceptualize the planets. Not as ancient gods, or a supermassive material object in the sky, but as ensouled, non-material forces of nature, like tides or winds, but endowed with wills of their own, surrounded by spirits instead of satellite moons, and draped in syncretic imagery drawn up from the wellspring of the past. What Ficino would ultimately do is take this evolution one step further, holding the heavenly bodies to be signs and not causes. To him, the wise astrologer used them to understand God's providence, not to imprison themselves in a web of causal action. In this, 15th century style of spiritual magic, we see the soul acting as a mediator between God and the body, or the one and matter. As such, an individual may begin their spiritual journey on the material level, from the literal, factual understanding of cause and effect processes caused by rays, but this is only the first step. From this foundation, one must develop more refined levels of perception through analogies, metaphors, and symbols, all the way until one reaches the anagogical moral levels, and then moves on to the level of perfected mystical contemplation. In his On Obtaining Life from the Heavens, Ficino sees this ladder of natural philosophical exegesis revealed through the hierarchy of the 7 planets. The Moon, Mercury, and Venus correspond to the material and the sensory. The Sun and Mars correspond to the imagination. Jupiter corresponds to reason, and Saturn to the contemplative intellect. Already during Ficino's lifetime, this planet-to-intellectual faculty arrangement would find its parallels among the Kabbalists of the 15th and 16th centuries, like Yohanan Alamano, a convert to Christianity in 1484, who equivocated the Sephirot with the planets in a similar fashion. So, what does the PICATRIX itself, in the Latin form which was part of Ficino's development, have to say about Saturn? In order to understand this, we can turn to one of our best sources as laid out in Book 3, Chapter 1, on the roles of the planets in plants, animals, and metals, which might best be thought of as a literary form of the popular Planetenkinder images from the Renaissance, that is, an astrological art form that features one of the 7 planets personified as a deity above, with all of its planet children below, representative of their myriad influences down here on Earth. So I begin this quote from the PICATRIX. Saturn is the source of retentive power. He governs an aspect toward profound knowledge, the science of law, the search for causes, effects, and the origins of things, the utterance of magical words, and the knowledge of deep and occult properties. From the languages, he governs Hebrew and Chaldean. From the external appendages, he governs the right ear. From the internal organs, he governs the spleen, which is the source of melancholy conjoining all organs. From the religions, he governs Judaism. From cloth types, he governs all black cloth. From the crafts, he rules working the soil, plowing, digging, extracting and working minerals, and the building trades. From the tastes, he governs the bitter. Among locations, he governs black mountains, murky rivers, deep wells, ditches, and desert places. From the stones, he governs onyx and all black stones. From the metals, he governs lead, iron, and all black musty metals. From the trees, he governs elderberries, oaks, carobs, palms, and vines. From the herbs, he governs cumin, rue, onion, and all the plants that have deep leaves. From the kinds of aloe, myrrh, and similar things, he governs white lead and colocynth. From the incenses, he strongly governs cinnamon and storax gum. From the animals, he governs black camels, pigs, monkeys, bears, dogs, and cats. From the birds, he governs all those with a long neck and a powerful cry, like cranes, ostriches, duga, and crows. He governs all the animals that live beneath the earth, all the tiny, juicy, and foul-smelling creatures. From the colors, he governs every black and tawny color. End quote. The text goes on to state the color of Saturn is like burnt wool, and that his image is, quote, the shape of a black man wrapped in a green cloak, with a dog head and a sickle in his hand. When Saturn is in a favorable astrological position, the details of which I don't want to get into too much here, and when you wish to pray to him, the PICATRIX says, dress yourself in black clothes, that is, let all the clothes on your body be black, with a black cape tailored in the manner of a professor. Wear black shoes. Go to a place assigned to such a task, remote from mankind, and humbly chosen. Walk there with a humble will, in the fashion of a Jew, for Saturn was the lord of their Sabbath. Hold an iron ring in your hand, and carry an iron censer. In it, place burning charcoal upon which you should set the suffumigating mixture whose recipe is this. Take equal parts of opium, aktarag, which is an herb, saffron, laurel seed, carob, wormwood, lanolin, colocynth, and the head of a black cat. Grind them up and mix everything together with the urine of a black she-goat in equal parts, and then make some tablets out of it. When you wish to operate, place one of these on the burning coals of the censer. Then, turn your face towards Saturn, and while the smoke rises from the censer, say this prayer. O Lord on high, whose name is great and stands firm in place above all the heavens' planets, he whom God placed sublime and lofty. You are Lord Saturn, cold and dry, dark, author of good, honest in your friendship, true in your promises, enduring and persevering in your amity and hatred. Your perception is far and deep, honest in your words and promises, alone, lonely, removed from others in your works, with sadness and pain, removed from rejoicing and festivities. You are old, ancient, wise, the despoiler of good intellect. You are a doer of good and of evil. Wretched and sad is he who is cursed by your misfortunes. The man who attains your fortune is blessed indeed. In you God placed the power and strength and a spirit doing both good and evil. I ask you, Father and Lord, by your lofty names and wondrous acts, that you should do such and such a thing for me. End quote. We are then instructed to speak our requests, prostrate ourselves on the ground towards Saturn with humility, sadness, gentleness, and a purified will. If we do this many times on a Saturday, in the hour of Saturn, then know that our requests will be fulfilled with effect. There are a number of operations dedicated to or pertaining to Saturn throughout the PICATRIX, but in the interest of time, I'll have to highlight some of the key points of interest. The following section, 3.7.17, goes on to state that there are other sages who used to pray to Saturn with different prayers and suffumigations. In one prayer, Saturn is invoked by all of his names. In Arabic, Zohal; in Latin, Saturnus; in Phoenician, Kavin; in Roman, Korones; in Greek, Hakoronos; in Indian, Sakas. We're then instructed to sacrifice a black goat by cutting off its head and gathering the blood for keepsake, but not before removing its liver and burning it, thus fully scattering the animal's constituent rays back into the universal matrix and fulfilling the ritual conditions required to bring down the spirits. Yet another sacrifice entails taking an unblemished cow, reared on grass, handpicked by young maidens every morning, then crowning its horns with golden chains and cutting off its head with a sword while suffumigating it with the mixture attributed to Saturn, and then speaking, quote, in the manner of the Greeks. This particular set of instructions, which should strike you as a description of a generic Greco-Roman styled pagan religious sacrifice, seems to be more a description of an operation that Sabaean sages did in the past than something that our author necessarily exhorts us to do now. The text says that a priest would then cut out the cow's tongue, ears, snout, and eyes, while the rest of those present took their share of the meat. Afterward, they would stare into the blood which had been collected into a saucer and examine the froth rising up from the blood. From that froth, it is said, they understood the dominion and motion of Saturn, which according to them is the first motion, because in him motion begins and ends. This kind of sacrifice they used to make only when Saturn entered the sign of Taurus. In another set of operations drawn up from Ibn Washia's Nabatean or Chaldean agriculture, there are instructions for making a suffumigation of old hides, fat, sweat, dead bats, and mice. 14 bats and 14 mice, to be exact. We are told the Chaldeans would take the ashes from this sacrifice and sprinkle them over the head of the ritual image they had crafted in the appropriate astrological hours. Then, quote, they threw themselves down around the image on a black stone floor, end quote. From these efforts, they warded off his, that is Saturn's, malefic or unfortunate effects, since every evil, every cursed thing, every tear was believed to proceed from him. He is the Lord of all poverty, misery, pain, imprisonment, turpitude, and lamentation, says the text. He signifies these things while descending and unfortunate. When he is in a good disposition, and in his exaltation, however, he signifies purity, lifespan, social standing, rejoicing, honor, riches, inheritance, and the durability of inheritance in sons and grandsons. End quote. So here we can see that Saturn is not all harm and damage, as he was typically considered by many a casual chart-making astrologer in the earlier Middle Ages. Rather, whether he acted as a malefic or a benefic was here entirely dependent upon a whole slew of astrological factors. Later in the text, we're told in a list of aphorisms, according to Mercurius's Secret of Secrets, that the best thing for which to entreat Saturn are, quote, delaying movement, concealing purity, the destruction of cities, the humbling of hearts, and the calming of waters. All of which, except perhaps the destruction of cities, could be considered morally neutral acts. It is here, thanks to the influence of PICATRIX passages such as these, that Ficino was first prompted to reconceptualize his relationship with that dark star ruling so prominently in his birth chart. In relating all these ostensibly pagan, magical operations and planetary prayers, PICATRIX tells us explicitly that, quote, "We have included this prayer here solely for demonstrating the common agreement between the ancient sages concerning the planetary operations and the constant protection of their bodies by means of planetary natures. We include that prayer in this book such that nothing intelligible in this work of ancient sages may be lacking." Now, since this prayer is forbidden in our law, we included it here merely for uncovering the ancient sages' secrets, since they performed this ritual in ancient times before the law was given. For this reason, no one must reveal these things, since despite everything I've said about this and other rituals, I am and shall always be a teacher with good intentions. End quote. That's from Book 3, Chapter 8, Section 4. Here, in stressing his good intentions, Al-Qurtubi hints to us that he is flirting with the boundaries of legitimacy in relating this sort of information, but that it seems at least valuable enough to him to assume the risk of relating it. Some 5 centuries later, Ficino's apology, written for a Christian audience, would hardly differ. Priestcraft, medicine, magic, and astrology were all seen as inseparable disciplines among the sages of old, and as such, one could not with any degree of authority deal with one of these elements in isolation from the others. One prominent and mutually influential association which I would like to turn to now before concluding is that which stood specifically between Saturn and the Jews. This connection has been explored in some detail by Eric Zafran in a 1979 article entitled just that, Saturn and the Jews. Though this association was fleshed out over the centuries and across various cultures since antiquity, in Western Europe it became increasingly laden with a great deal of anti-Semitic baggage, especially around the 15th century. During this time, widespread negative associations with Saturn became inextricably intertwined with widespread negative associations with Jews, and in many instances, these mutually reinforced one another, particularly in the realm of art. This phenomenon has also been studied in some depth by Moshe Idel in his monograph Saturn's Jews, on the witches, Sabbath, and Sabbateanism, which explores how misperception of the Jewish Sabbath by non-Jews led to a connection between Jews and witchcraft on the idea that the Sabbaths of witches were somehow connected with the Jewish holy day. The initial association between Saturn and the Jews began in Roman times, with much of the ideas connecting Saturn and the Jews springing out from the initial idea that Saturn governed the day of the Jewish Sabbath. Among the days of the week, the 7th day, the day of rest for the Jewish people in celebration of the day when the infinite creative power of God ceased, was linked to the 7th planet that came to symbolize the power of inertia or retention. Saturn was considered the oldest of the planets, and Judaism the oldest religion. Just as Saturn's sphere encapsulated all the other planetary spheres within itself, Judaism was thought to have borne all other faiths from within itself. As Klebansky, Panofsky, and Saxel noted, even St. Augustine had proclaimed Saturn to be the god of the Jews. The link can be seen in Abu Mashar's works, and sometime later, the Arab astrologer Al-Kabizi, or Alcabitius in Europe, attributed the, quote, faith of Judaism to Saturn in the 10th century, around the same time that Al-Qurtubi, writing in Islamic Spain, was authoring the Hayat al-Hakim, not to be translated into European languages until the mid-13th century. Similar concepts connecting Saturn and the Jews were elaborated at length in the historical theory of great conjunctions, an idea of significant interest to Roger Bacon in the 13th century as part and parcel to his wider eschatological speculations. Bacon writes the following in his Opus Maius, a theory taken almost word for word from Abu Mashar. The philosophers want Jove in his conjunction with the other planets to signify religions and faith. And because there are 6 planets with which he can come into conjunction, they maintain that there should be 6 principal religions, sectas principales. If he comes into conjunction with Saturn, it means the holy books, that is, Judaism, which is older than the others, just as Saturn is the father of the planets. If Jupiter comes into conjunction with Mars, it means the Chaldean law, which teaches the worship of fire. If it is with the Sun, it means the Egyptian law, which means that one worships the celestial army led by the Sun. If with Venus, it means the law of the Saracens, which is pleasure-loving and lascivious, and if it is with Mercury, the Mercurial law, which is Christianity, until, at last, the law of the moon will come to disturb it, and that is the sect of the Antichrist. It should be mentioned that this theory would later be explicitly rejected by Ficino on account of its overly deterministic character. In PICATRIX, however, each of the planets have their own respective religions to govern, but the planet-to-religion breakdown differs somewhat from that of Abu Mashar's Great Conjunction scheme. PICATRIX's breakdown is as follows: Saturn, Judaism; Jupiter, Christianity; Mars, heresy and apostasy; the Sun, paganism or Sabaeanism; Venus, Islam; Mercury, philosophy, materialism, and skepticism; and the Moon, those who worship idols and images. What the theory of great conjunctions and PICATRIX do have in common, however, is the fundamental association between Saturn and the Jews. Here, by virtue of their mutual antiquity, both the Hebrew and Chaldean tongues are kept under Saturn's jurisdiction. Astrology was no mere tabloid trifle or isolated discipline during this era. To use the words of Eugenio Garin, the Middle Ages were greatly concerned with, quote, astrology and religion, astrology and politics, astrology and propaganda, but also astrology and medicine, astrology and science, a philosophy of history, a conception of reality, a fatalistic naturalism, and an astral cult. Astrology was all these and more. End quote. What came to a head in the Italian Renaissance was the sheer volume of all these different astrological ideas, with all their internal contrasts and contradictions, building up to what Thomas Kuhn would describe as the crisis preceding the paradigm shift. And all this was happening precisely while the Studia Humanitatis began remapping these astral deities with imagery drawn up from the classics. One curious element of this fascination with astrology and culture was what Moshe Idel called the Saturnization of Judaism, and in turn the Judaization of Saturn. By the end of this process, in the late 15th and 16th centuries, even European Jewish Kabbalists like Yohanan Alamano, working from earlier Spanish or Sephardic sources, were expressing the astromagical link between ancient history, the land of Israel, Moses, the temple, the Torah, prophetic inspiration, the Sabbath, and esoteric knowledge with Saturn. I will read you a fairly extensive quote by Yohanan Alamano right here. This is from an untitled treatise on the Sephirot of Binah. And the third sphere, that of Saturn, is a supreme and noble one, higher than all the other planets, which is the reason that the ancient sages said about it that it generated all the other planets. And they say that Saturn is the true judge and the planet of Moses, peace be with him. The angel of Saturn is Michael, the great minister, so called because of his great power in divine matters, and he is the ministering angel of Israel. And the astrologers who have described Saturn say that it endows man with profound thought, law, and the spiritual sciences, the chokmot ruhaniyot, prophecy, nevuah, sorcery, kishshuf, prognostication, and the shemitot and yovelot. The Jewish people and the Hebrew language and the temple are under its jurisdiction. Saturn's major conjunction is with Jupiter in the dominion of Pisces, and occurs to assist the nation and the Torah and its prophets. This planet endows the people with perfection in sciences and divine matters such as the Torah and its commandments, out of its sublimity because it is spiritual. It is concerned only with thought, understanding, and design, esoteric knowledge, and divine worship, and his Torah, and the Sabbath day is in its sway, because its nature causes material existence to cease, and all the operations that do not correspond to it are forbidden, because it corrupts and destroys all destructions. And lightning, that is fire, should not be done under its aegis, that is, during the Sabbath, because it is cold. And if they keep its spiritual rules and laws, it will impart a spiritual influx abundantly. But if they do not keep the way of God, it will spit forth everything that is bad. Prophecy will occur to fools and to babes in an insufficient manner, and to women and to melancholics, and to those possessed by an evil spirit, and maleficent demons that obliterate the limbs, and bad counsels and sorceries, and anxieties and erroneous beliefs. So Idel takes this passage to represent the Saturnization of Judaism as inspired by the writings of the Toledan rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, whose dates are 1089 to 1164, but also to his circle of commentators. This he does on account of its numerous parallels with the passages that follow here, and it's quite possible that his description of the links between Saturn and Judaism were also shaped by an acquaintance with the PICATRIX in one of its forms, whether directly or indirectly. So, although it's possible that PICATRIX had some part to play in this connection, already by the 15th century, the period wherein the text was just re-emerging, numerous popular images and almanacs across Europe were already explicitly stating or demonstrating how the planet governing the fate of the Jews was, of course, that most maligned and unfortunate of planets. For instance, an almanac printed by Johannes Ottmar at Reutlingen predicted that Christians would have a fortunate year through the influence of their prevailing planets, Mercury and the Sun. The Jews, however, would be vexed with misfortunes by fire and wind through the poor conditions of their planet, Saturn. It seems, therefore, to use the succinct words of Eric Safran, that a current of thought over a great span of time relates the Jews and Saturn. I would like to stress, however, that these links were principally made up of ideas inherited from Neoplatonic medieval texts on magic and astrology, and not chiefly from classical sources, at least until the 16th century. When it comes to the association between Saturn and sorcery specifically, I would propose that it may be related to the ostensible role that external action plays in Judaism. That is, how outsiders perceive Jewish ritual in all of its complexities. These complexities were consonant in the imaginations of Christian or Islamic magicians with the practical character of talismanic or ceremonial magic, known as nigromancia at the time. In both magic and Judaism, there are complicated systems of commandments, the maintenance of ritual purity, adherence to specific ritual times, reliance on ancient scriptures, and so forth. These are all concepts which extend analogically into the dominion of Saturn and are likely to account for a good deal of these associations. In conclusion, we've taken a look at a number of associations attributed to Saturn in astrological texts from a number of different cultures. We looked at some of the prayers, suffumigations, sacrifices, and other ritual conditions required to conjure up Saturn's spirits as laid out explicitly in the PICATRIX and some of that work's constituent sources. We saw how, although many of these associations have their roots in the polytheistic imagery of antiquity, the very concept of what a planet is and how it operates underwent dramatic change throughout the Middle Ages as it crossed cultures. We saw how this ancient divinity, with all his attendant mythology, was, from a rather early time, demoted to a largely malefic force of nature by the astrologers, and how this purely negative image was gradually restored to a state of ambivalence through the Neoplatonic writings of Marsilio Ficino, in which PICATRIX played a formative role. Lastly, we saw to what extent the various aspects of Saturnine imagery became indissolubly entangled with negative perceptions of Jews in the European imagination. Thank you for listening. My name is D.Att, and if you would like a bibliography for this presentation, please check the notes.